First story, by Sarah Anderson. It was an ordinary Friday evening in my suburban home in Portland, Oregon. The sun had set, leaving behind an inky black sky and a sprinkling of stars that barely pierced the veil of city lights. I had just settled in for a quiet night when I heard a rustling in the bushes outside my bedroom window. I tiptoed to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting eerie shadows on the floor. There, in the garden, stood a man. He was tall, with long disheveled hair and ragged clothes. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his presence sent a chill down my spine. I watched in horror as he began to do something inexplicable. He started plucking the petals off my prized rosebush, one by one, dropping them to the ground as if performing some bizarre ritual. Each petal seemed to fall in perfect silence, and the only sound was my own rapid breathing. Unable to tear my eyes away, I watched as he moved on to the next flower bed, systematically destroying my carefully nurtured plants. His movements were deliberate and methodical, and he seemed entirely unaware of my presence. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. I felt a surge of anger and fear. I needed to do something. My trembling hands reached for the phone, but just as I was about to dial 911, the man turned and looked directly at me through the window. His eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion or humanity. It was as though he were staring into my soul. My heart raced as I fumbled with the phone, but when I looked back out the window, the man was gone. I rushed downstairs and out into the garden, but there was no sign of him. Only the wreckage of my once beautiful flowers remained. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in my garden seemed to conceal his presence. I installed motion-activated lights and locked every door and window. But despite my precautions, I couldn't escape the lingering dread that he might return one night to finish what he had started. Second story, by Mark Johnson. My story begins in the quaint town of Waterford, nestled in the heart of Vermont. It was a picturesque place, known for its friendly residents and lush, green landscapes. I had always considered myself lucky to live here, until that fateful night when my idyllic life was shattered. It started innocently enough, with odd happenings in my garden. The first sign was the disappearance of my garden tools. I had left them neatly arranged in the shed, but they were gone the next morning. I assumed it was just a prank by some local kids and thought nothing more of it. But then the incidents escalated. My prized tomatoes were slashed, their pulpy insides oozing onto the soil. My herbs were uprooted, and strange symbols were etched into the earth. The once tranquil garden had become a canvas for chaos. One moonless night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured into the garden, determined to catch the culprits red-handed. As I scanned the area, my flashlight beam fell on a shadowy figure crouched by the rose bushes. My heart stopped. The intruder was unlike anyone I had ever seen. He wore tattered clothes that hung loosely from his emaciated frame. His long, unkempt hair obscured most of his face, but his eyes glinted with an unsettling intensity. He was whispering to the roses in a language I couldn't comprehend, his voice a haunting murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I froze, unable to tear my gaze away from this bizarre scene. The intruder seemed oblivious to my presence, lost in his macabre ritual. I had no idea what he was doing, but it was clear that I needed to get out of there. Slowly, I began to retreat, my heart pounding in my chest. As I backed away, a twig snapped beneath my foot, and the intruder's head snapped up. Those hollow eyes locked onto mine, and a sinister smile stretched across his face. Panic surged through me as I turned and ran back to the safety of my home. I locked the doors and called the police, trying to explain the inexplicable. When they arrived, the garden was empty, save for the devastation left behind. No one ever found out who the intruder was or what he had been doing in my garden. The incidents ceased, and life in Waterford returned to its peaceful rhythm. But I could never shake the feeling that I had encountered something otherworldly that night, something beyond explanation. Third story, by Michael Reed. Chicago's suburbs are known for their peaceful streets and well-manicured lawns. It was in this tranquil setting that I found myself face to face with a horrifying stranger who invaded my garden one fateful night. It was a warm summer evening when I first noticed something amiss. I had been sitting on my porch, sipping a glass of lemonade and enjoying the gentle breeze, when I heard a soft, eerie melody. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on me, but the haunting tune grew louder, echoing through the neighborhood. I ventured into my backyard, guided by the ethereal music. Moonlight bathed the garden in a silvery glow, revealing a tall figure standing amidst the roses. The stranger was dressed in a tattered suit, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. In his hands he held an old, weathered violin. The melody he played was both beautiful and chilling, a haunting composition that seemed to transcend the boundaries of reality. I watched in awe and terror as the stranger's bow danced across the strings, producing a mournful symphony that sent shivers down my spine. As I approached, the stranger continued to play, his fingers moving with unnatural precision. His eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, never left mine. It was as though he were beckoning me closer, drawing me into his eerie performance. Unable to resist, I took a hesitant step forward. The closer I got, the more unsettling the scene became. The roses around the stranger seemed to wither and die, their petals falling to the ground in a macabre dance. It was as though the music itself had the power to drain the life from the plants. Just as I was about to speak, the stranger abruptly stopped playing. The silence that followed was deafening. He slowly lowered the violin, his eyes locked onto mine. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel a wave of malevolence emanating from him. Without a word, the stranger turned and vanished into the night, leaving behind a garden in disarray and an indelible sense of dread. I never saw him again, but the memory of that encounter haunted my dreams for years to come. Fourth story, by Emily Martinez. I live in a quaint cottage in the heart of rural England, far removed from the hustle and bustle of city life. My garden had always been a source of solace and tranquility, but that serenity was shattered one gloomy evening. It was a foggy night, with the air heavy and thick. The occasional hoot of an owl was the only sound that broke the silence. As I sat by the window, sipping on a cup of tea, I noticed a strange flickering light in the garden. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the mist, but as I peered closer, I realized it was a lantern. I stepped outside, my breath forming white puffs in the cold air. The lantern hung from a gnarled tree branch, casting an eerie glow over the garden. And there, in the dim light, I saw him, a tall, cloaked figure, his face obscured by a hood. Fear gripped my heart as I watched the intruder. He moved with deliberate slowness, his hands holding a bundle of dried herbs. With each step, he muttered incantations in a language I couldn't comprehend. The words sent shivers down my spine, as though they were a summons to some malevolent force. I hid behind a bush, my heart pounding, and watched as the stranger approached my beloved rosebush. With a swift motion, he scattered the herbs around its base, and the air was filled with a sickly, sweet aroma. The roses seemed to writhe in agony, their once vibrant petals turning ashen and withered. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. The cloaked figure moved on, repeating the ritual with each of my cherished plants. It was as though he were draining the life from my garden, sapping the vitality from every living thing. As he neared the end of his sinister task, the stranger turned and looked directly at me. Even though his face was hidden in shadow, I could feel his malevolent gaze piercing through me. I held my breath, praying that he hadn't seen me. To my relief, he continued on his way, disappearing into the mist. I waited until he was gone before rushing to my garden, but it was too late. My once thriving plants had been reduced to lifeless husks, and the air still carried the lingering scent of the herbs. I never saw the cloaked figure again, but the memory of that night continues to haunt me. My garden, once a source of comfort, now stands as a chilling testament to the inexplicable and the horrifying. Fifth story, by John Smith. Upstate New York had always been a place of tranquil beauty, with its lush forests and pristine lakes. I had moved to a small town in this picturesque region to escape the chaos of the city, but what I encountered in my garden one summer night would forever change my perception of serenity. It was a clear night, the stars shimmering in the vast expanse of the sky. As I sat on my porch, savoring a glass of wine, I noticed a faint rustling in the trees. At first, I dismissed it as the gentle sighing of the wind, but the rustling grew louder and more erratic. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the garden. The beam of light revealed a disheveled man, crouched by the edge of the woods. He was muttering to himself, his words a nonsensical jumble of phrases and incantations. My heart pounded as I watched the stranger's bizarre behavior. He moved with a frantic energy, his hands digging into the earth and his fingers smearing something dark and viscous across the ground. It was a substance I couldn't identify, but its odor was nauseating, a mix of decay and something far more sinister. As I approached, the stranger suddenly stopped and turned to face me. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his face contorted into a grotesque mask of madness. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice rising to a frenzied pitch as he accused me of harboring dark secrets. I backed away, my fear escalating with each step. The stranger's accusations grew more unhinged, and I realized that I needed to call the authorities. But as I turned to retrieve my phone, I heard a guttural chant emanating from the woods behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam revealing a circle of figures, cloaked in tattered robes and illuminated by flickering torches. Their chant grew louder and more sinister, and I could feel the air crackling with an otherworldly energy. With a surge of terror, I fled from the garden, the cacophonous chanting and the stranger's accusations echoing in my ears. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the intruders were gone, leaving behind a garden in ruins and a trail of dread that would linger for years. To this day, I have no explanation for what transpired that night. All I know is that my peaceful garden had been transformed into a place of terror, a chilling reminder that darkness can lurk even in the most serene of settings. Sixth story, by Daniel Evans. I had always cherished the tranquility of my village in the English countryside. The quaint thatched cottages and rolling hills made it seem like a place untouched by time. However, one fateful evening, as I tended to my garden, that tranquility was shattered. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow across the landscape. I was on my knees, carefully pruning my roses, when I heard a soft rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced up, searching for the source of the disturbance. There, emerging from the shadows, was a man. He was dressed in ragged clothing, his face obscured by a mop of tangled hair. His gaunt frame and hollow eyes told a tale of suffering, and in his trembling hand, he clutched a bundle of wilted flowers. Without a word, the stranger knelt beside me, his gaze fixed on the roses. I watched in silence as he began to whisper to the flowers in a voice filled with despair. The words were incomprehensible, a strange and haunting incantation that sent shivers down my spine. As the stranger continued his eerie ritual, I noticed that the roses were withering before my eyes, their vibrant petals wilting and turning to ash. It was as though the very life was being drained from them, leaving behind a haunting reminder of their former beauty. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. The stranger's presence exuded an air of sorrow and malevolence that chilled me to the bone. I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape from this inexplicable nightmare, but I was paralyzed by fear. Just as suddenly as he had appeared, the stranger rose to his feet, his tattered clothing billowing in the evening breeze. He turned and looked at me, his eyes filled with an indescribable anguish. Then, with a mournful sigh, he vanished into the gathering darkness. I was left alone in the garden, surrounded by the remnants of my once beautiful roses and the haunting memory of the enigmatic stranger. I never saw him again, but his presence continued to haunt my village, a chilling reminder that even in the most peaceful of places, darkness could find its way in. Seventh Story by Mia Rodriguez. Living in a charming coastal town in California, I had always felt blessed by the natural beauty that surrounded me. My garden, with its vibrant flowers and the soothing sound of the nearby ocean, was my sanctuary. Little did I know that it would become the setting for a series of eerie and unsettling events that would shatter my sense of peace. It all began on a foggy evening, the ocean waves crashing against the rocks in the distance. I was sipping a glass of wine on my porch, watching the tendrils of mist roll in, when I noticed a strange figure at the edge of my garden. The intruder was tall and thin, shrouded in a tattered cloak that billowed in the salty breeze. Their face was hidden beneath a hood, casting their features into shadow. In their hand they held a lantern that emitted an eerie, flickering light. My heart raced as I watched the figure move through the garden with an unnatural grace. They seemed to glide rather than walk, and the lantern cast eerie, dancing shadows across the flowers. It was as though they were performing a macabre dance amidst the blossoms. As I cautiously approached, the figure knelt by a bed of roses, their bony fingers gently caressing the petals. Their voice, barely more than a whisper, carried an otherworldly quality as they murmured words that I couldn't comprehend. The roses seemed to respond, their blossoms opening and closing in time with the strange incantation. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I watched this eerie spectacle. The figure moved from flower to flower, and with each passing moment, the air grew colder, and the world seemed to blur around me. It was as though the garden itself was being drawn into a sinister enchantment. Suddenly, the figure turned to face me, their hidden gaze locking onto mine. My blood ran cold as I saw the faint, ghostly glimmer of their eyes. Without a word, they extinguished the lantern and melted into the mist, leaving behind a garden that felt changed, somehow tainted. In the days that followed, my once vibrant garden seemed to wither, and strange, otherworldly sounds echoed through the night. The presence of the mysterious figure lingered, a shadow that I couldn't escape. I never learned their true identity or their purpose, but the memory of that haunting encounter would forever haunt my coastal paradise. 8th story, by Thomas Wright. Nestled in the suburbs of New Jersey, my life had always been ordinary and predictable. That was until the night when my peaceful existence was disrupted by an intruder in my garden, an encounter that would leave me questioning reality itself. It was a moonless night, and I had stepped outside to enjoy the cool breeze and the quiet rustling of leaves. As I gazed up at the starry sky, a feeling of unease settled over me, as though I were being watched. I shook off the sensation as mere paranoia and turned my attention back to the garden. That's when I saw him. A man stood at the edge of my property, just beyond the pool of dim light from the porch. He wore a long, dark coat that billowed ominously in the night breeze. His face was concealed behind a grotesque, porcelain mask with exaggerated features, an eerie, frozen smile etched upon it. My heart raced as I watched the intruder, my breath caught in my throat. What could possess a man to don such a sinister mask and invade someone's garden in the middle of the night? The masked figure began to move with slow, deliberate steps, almost as if he were performing a macabre dance. He approached a cluster of shrubs, and in his gloved hand, he held a small, ornate box. He opened it, revealing a collection of intricate, metallic insects that glinted ominously in the dim light. I watched in a mix of fascination and terror as he carefully arranged the miniature insects around the base of the shrubs. He muttered something under his breath, a chant in a language I couldn't comprehend, and the metallic insects seemed to come to life, their wings buzzing with an unnatural energy. The air grew heavy with an eerie tension as I stood there, paralyzed by fear and curiosity. The masked intruder turned and, with an unsettling grace, approached me. His empty eyes bored into mine through the lifeless eyes of the porcelain mask. A cold chill washed over me as I finally managed to tear my gaze away. I stumbled back into the safety of my house, locking the doors behind me. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the masked figure had disappeared, leaving only the chilling remnants of his bizarre ritual. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the masked intruder still lurked in the shadows. My garden, once a place of solace, had become a haunting reminder of the inexplicable and the terrifying. 9th story, by Sophie Thompson. Living in a remote cabin in the Colorado Rockies was a dream come true for me. The solitude, the towering pine trees, and the crisp mountain air made it feel like I was living in a different world. But that dream would soon morph into a chilling nightmare, all thanks to an unseen presence in my garden. It began with the subtlest of changes, a faint rustling in the underbrush, a quiet tapping on my bedroom window in the dead of night. At first, I brushed it off as the sounds of the wilderness. However, as the days passed, the disturbances grew more unsettling. One evening, I ventured outside to investigate. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the forest into a sea of shadows. I felt a sense of unease wash over me as I moved through the garden, my flashlight revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But then I heard it, a low, mournful humming that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath my feet. It was a sound that sent shivers down my spine, a haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I followed the eerie hum to the edge of the garden, where I stumbled upon a strange sight. In the moonlight, I saw a circle of mushrooms, their caps glowing with an otherworldly luminescence. The humming seemed to be coming from these mushrooms, and as I approached, the sound grew louder, more oppressive. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way, and I tumbled into a dark, underground chamber. The walls were covered in strange, runic symbols, and at the center of the chamber stood a gnarled tree, its branches twisted and unnatural. I watched in horror as the tree seemed to come to life, its branches reaching out with a malevolent intent. It was then that I sensed a presence, an entity that pulsed with a sinister energy. It whispered in a language I couldn't understand, its voice a chilling chorus of murmurs and sighs. In a panic, I scrambled to escape the underground chamber, clawing my way through the earth and back into my garden. The humming had stopped, and the eerie presence seemed to have vanished. I rushed back into my cabin, my heart pounding, determined to put this terrifying ordeal behind me. But the garden was forever changed. The once vibrant flowers had withered, the trees bore a sickly pallor, and the air seemed heavy with a malevolent force. I couldn't explain what had happened that night, but I knew that I had encountered something beyond the realm of the natural, something that would forever haunt my remote mountain paradise. 10th Story by Rachel O'Connor. Nestled deep in the heart of the Louisiana bayou, my life had always been one of solitude and serenity. Surrounded by the thick, moss-draped trees and the haunting call of the cicadas, I felt a deep connection to the natural world. But that connection would soon take a terrifying turn when an enigmatic visitor began to haunt my garden. It started one sweltering summer night when I was tending to my garden, the air thick with the scent of magnolias and the chorus of frogs. As I knelt among the flowers, I heard a soft, melodic humming that seemed to resonate with the very rhythm of the bayou. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the humming grew louder and more distinct. I followed the sound, my flashlight guiding me through the darkness. The source of the humming was a figure standing at the edge of the garden, their back turned to me. They were swaying gently, their long, tangled hair cascading down their shoulders. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure's voice was hauntingly beautiful as they sang a song in a language I couldn't understand. The flowers seemed to respond to their song, their petals opening and closing in time with the enchanting melody. I watched in awe and terror as the figure continued to sing, their voice carrying an unearthly power. It was as though they were weaving a spell over my garden, coaxing it to life in ways I had never thought possible. The air was thick with magic, and I felt a strange connection to the natural world around me. But then the figure turned to face me, and I gasped in horror. Their eyes were empty, void of any humanity, and their face bore an unsettling serenity that sent a chill down my spine. Without a word, they raised a finger to their lips, as if urging me to silence. I backed away slowly, my heart still racing. The figure turned back to the garden, and with one final, haunting note, they vanished into the bayou, leaving behind a garden that seemed to pulse with a newfound vitality. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. My garden continued to thrive, but it was forever changed, a testament to the mysterious and the unsettling that lurked in the heart of the bayou. Thank you for sticking with us through the whole video. Also, I recommend you this video you see on screen, one of the scariest on my channel. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. This helps me bring you more thrilling content every day. If this video sent shivers down your spine, let me know in the comments.